You want answers?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You want answers?
You have offended my family.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth!
And you have offended the Shaolin Temple.
You can't handle the truth!
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Radical Rant.
All right, I want to take a chance to look just north of me here in the Pacific Northwest to Washington State, where medical marijuana has been legal since 1998. But unlike every other medical marijuana state, Washington has no medical marijuana card registry. Now, most states have a mandatory registry, like down here in Oregon, and a couple of states, like California and Colorado, have a voluntary registry where you can get a registry card that protects you from arrest. Washington State has no such thing. It depends on the written recommendation or just the recommendation of a physician, but this has led to many patients being arrested in Washington State. Now, also, Washington never made a provision for patients to legally acquire medicine. So in that niche there, a system of questionably legal dispensaries have appeared. A bill to address these issues has passed the Washington State Senate, and it's now being heard in the House Ways and Means Committee. Now, medical marijuana dispensaries in Washington State are based on a novel legal theory that they aren't really storefronts selling cannabis to multiple patients, but they are an individual caregiver caring for the health of one individual patient at a time. Now, some lawmakers and police think it is ludicrous that someone is a total stranger's caregiver from the moment they approach a counter through the 90 seconds it takes for a transaction, and then they're no longer the caregiver as the next stranger approaches and becomes the single patient for that store counter caregiver. Some people, have a problem with that. And before we go much further, I better give you full disclosure because I might be a little bit biased on this issue. My wife has her license as a certified nurse's assistant and had spent many low-wage hours and injured her back and knees helping disabled elderly adults twice her size in and out of beds and on and off of toilets. She's changed the diapers of patients, fed the most disabled patients by hand, and been kicked and punched by patients with Alzheimer's agitation, and sat with loved ones in hospice as they watch their relatives pass on while racked with opiate-deadened pain. So forgive me a little if I get peeved at a weed dealer calling himself a caregiver, okay? All right, now the Washington medical marijuana law says, this is from chapter 69.51a of the RCW, purpose and intent. Persons who act as primary caregivers to such patients shall also not be found guilty of a crime under state law for assisting with the medical use of marijuana. Definitions. Primary caregiver means a person who is responsible for the housing, health, or care of the patient. And furthermore, qualifying the designated primary caregiver shall, and this is the part they pin the dispensary theory on, be the primary caregiver to only one patient at any one time. So again, that's their theory, is that, I'm sitting here behind a counter with a whole bunch of medicine, and a person, a total stranger to me, walks up and signs up to be my patient. I'm their caregiver. I'm only signing up with one person at one time. I provide them medicine, which is assisting with the medical use of marijuana, and then they leave, and then at that point they cease being my patient that I'm caring for, and the next stranger who walks up is the patient that I'm the caregiver for, right? Now, someone who voted for this law, who's not into medical marijuana, doesn't know the whole situation, would probably read those sections I read you to mean that a person who's a caregiver is somebody who's legitimately caring for a medical marijuana patient's housing, health, or care and only takes care of one patient. But now the medical marijuana dispensaries are interpreting it to mean, my exchange of cannabis for money counts as caring for a person's health so long as I'm assisting with the medical use of marijuana for only one patient at one time. Now, this might be legally defensible, but it's not common sense defensible. At Washington State's Department of Health site for nursing, they define a caregiver as anyone providing hands-on personal care and or assistance with daily care. Washington State's Caregiver Resources lists caregivers for aging, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, Easter seals, United Way style resources, people that go to your house and cook your food and, take care of your bathroom necessities, etc., right? Everywhere else you look in Washington law, a caregiver is someone who does more than merely dispense medicine to a patient. And while you do have to acquire medicine in order to use it medicinally, the act of acquisition is not the act of use. Now, There actually is a designation in Washington law for someone who just dispenses medicine to a patient. Yet, when I look in the 616-page Washington State Department of Health Board pharmacy laws and rules, there are only 2 references to caregiver. One's on page 257, referring to a product safety educational campaign that should include foster parents and other caregivers. Another is at page 578 that defines in-home care settings and how caregivers relate to that and to dispensaries. But in other words, nowhere in Washington law is a pharmacist referred to as a caregiver. Even if you can argue that his dispensation of medicine to sick and disabled patients is necessary for them to use those substances medicinally. Now, of course, pharmacists aren't allowed to dispense cannabis, which is why we have this whole caregiver acting as a pharmacist for patients who need cannabis. And look, my analysis here is not meant to demean the people doing that or the people taking advantage of that. We got to get medicine to sick patients. I'm just saying this, I'm not a dispensary, I'm a caregiver justification, is part of the reason why the voting public is increasingly buying into the meme that medical marijuana activists are really just pot dealers cleverly duping the public, that our cries of caregiving ring hollow in the face of profits, and that if they give us an inch of compassion, we'll exploit a mile of loopholes. Now, the Kitsap Sun reviewed the latest committee meeting on this bill, and here's a quote from the Sun. It says, "The current bill, introduced by State Senator Gene Colwells, Democrat of Seattle, would set up a regulatory system for licensing and monitoring medical marijuana producers, processors, and dispensers. It would also provide protection from prosecution for qualifying patients, healthcare professionals, producers, and dispensers. And it would establish a registry of patients and providers, which law enforcement could consult to make sure users, growers, and distributors are legal." Now, every time the subject of a registry comes up here, I hear complaints from some folks, and including in the Kitsap story, attorney Kent Underwood, who said, since marijuana remains illegal under federal laws, some fear that federal law might check the registry for leads on its cases. Look, every other medical marijuana state has either a mandatory registry system or a voluntary one, and none of them have ever had those databases queried by federal law enforcement. It's not happened. The feds have tried subpoenaing patient records and registry records, but they've never been successful. They're turned away by the courts every single time. The only law enforcement that can access the patient registry are the state and local cops, and they can only do it in pursuit of a case where they have probable cause, and they have to be identified and recorded when they access the database, and they can only get a yes or no answer as to whether a person or property is legally registered for medical possession or cultivation. They can't go on a fishing expedition to find out if a guy that they don't like is growing weed, and even if they did, what would they find out? They'd find out he's legal under the state law, and they couldn't go after him. There's no fish worth catching here, and the state local cops, there's nothing for them to be going after, and the federal cops aren't allowed to cast their line in the pond. If the fear here is that you're going to be on a list, oh my God, I don't want to be on a list, isn't the list of people not to arrest a good list to be on? If you're going to be on a list, I would think so. I obviously have a caregiver card here in the state of Oregon. I think it's much better to have a card that says, please don't take me away in handcuffs, than not. But that's my opinion. All right, let me go to this other part on this. The House Healthcare Committee made several changes to the Senate bill, including requiring the Washington Department of Health to set up a county-by-county quota of medical marijuana dispensaries. Well, that's good that we might have, at least a minimum number that are required in a county. All right. State licenses would be issued by lottery to a specific number of dispensaries in each county. Current dispensaries would not be guaranteed to receive licenses if the bill becomes law. This is a legitimate concern. This I have a problem with because, sure, these existing dispensaries, caregivers one at a time situations, may not be legal technically, but they do have experience. Why would we punish the caring provider and successful businessman with good intentions who's running a well-liked dispensary for years by letting a lottery reward some Johnny-come-lately carpet-bagging prohibition profiteer who's dealing street-priced eighth from a third-rate office? Why do we want to punish the guy who's doing it well, the guy who's got the clientele, who's got the experience in the business, and who has legitimately been helping people? Again, I don't want anybody to, because I know people will get upset at this, but, I'm upset with the tactic. I'm upset with this justification that has to be made, the way that it rings in the public domain and in the media. The act of actually getting the medicine to the patients, I applaud. I think that's a beautiful thing. But this lottery idea, reward guys that just showed up, late in the game to try to make a buck, they have just as much chance as the people who've been working in Washington State for decades now to help patients. That ain't right. That ain't right. Still, I think having a regulatory system for licensing and monitoring medical marijuana producers, processors, and dispensers in the law, I think that's a better protection than, well, my dispensary is just a primary caregiver to one patient at a time. I don't think that's going to protect you for very much longer. Now, one other part in this Washington bill I also have a big problem with. Another change forbids a doctor's practice from being solely concentrated on medical marijuana prescriptions. They mean recommendations. The media still does that. This is just a knee-jerk reaction of politicians who see medical marijuana clinics as some sort of, front to artificially inflate patient rolls. What they don't understand here is that most patients, almost every patient I know, would prefer their primary care provider would recommend cannabis for them, but they can't. If their doctor works for the Veterans Administration, they can't because it's against federal law. If their doctor's working for certain hospitals, working for certain HMOs, or carrying certain insurance, they can't recommend because their boss or their policy or their contract forbids them from doing so. There's even some doctors who could recommend, but they're so afraid of the stigma and any interference with their federal prescription license that they won't do it. And then there's some who legitimately might want to help a patient or two, but they don't want to become known as a pot doc and then get flooded with requests from everybody, from a bunch of their other patients. So the majority of their patients can't get their medical marijuana recommendation from their doctor. So they go to the additional trouble of gathering up all their medical records, in most cases for the past 3 years, and then they take them to a medical marijuana clinic where they have another doctor, a specialist who understands medical marijuana, review all those records and make sure they qualify. This isn't California where they can walk into any old doctor tent and, say they have anxiety and walk out with a recommendation. This doctor, this specialist in these, medical marijuana specialty clinics, they have to review these records and they have to qualify under very stringent conditions, right? And then basically what we're saying here is that any patient who's going to one of these specialty clinics has essentially been recommended by 2 doctors. They've already had their condition verified by their primary care physician, and now it's been the second opinion. It's been verified a second time by the medical marijuana doctor. And that you have a problem with, that you're going to take away from people. You're going to take away their right to be a legal medical marijuana patient because they happen to have the wrong doctor who's a VA doctor or works for Blue Cross Blue Shield or Kaiser or any number legacy healthcare system, whatever. That's going to be the reason you're going to make them a criminal again. This is just insane. So there are good and bad points to this Washington State medical marijuana bill that's currently in the House Ways and Means Committee. To me, the addition of a registry and the regulation of dispensaries are good things, but this distributing it through a lottery and trying to restrict the medical marijuana doctors are bad things. This is not the final bill. It can be amended. Contact your Washington State legislators, and we've got a list of them at normal.org. Also, check out Washington Normal at wanormal.org. That's the Radical Rant for now. When we come back, we'll be debunking some reefer madness from Gateway Gill, who buffaloes Buffalo, right after this.